Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Finding Funding for Your Research Project workshop. If you found your way here, you are likely someone who wants money to do research. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to focus on finding funding opportunities for your research project and how to be successful in receiving funding. I'm your workshop host for today, Ashley Kwan. I am the Research Development Specialist with the Department of Evaluation and Research Services with Fraser Health, and I will be speaking to you about the context of finding and receiving research funding within Fraser Health. Now, before I begin the content of this workshop today, I want to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. I also want to acknowledge that as members of Fraser Health, we work in spaces that are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish and Tla'amin nations. And the land is also home to 6 Métis chartered communities. So let us reflect on that during this workshop today. Today, we're going to focus on 2 components in this workshop. First, how do you track down funding opportunities? And then we'll move on to how to prepare a strong competitive application in the second part of this workshop so that you will actually be able to have resources to navigate the process of receiving funding to ensure that you find and then actually are able to follow through and get research funding. We have resources within Fraser Health as well, so I will also either remind you or let you know of those for the first time to know what we can support with you with as you navigate this process of finding and receiving research funding. For Fraser Health staff and medical staff, our department within Fraser Health, the Department of Evaluation and Research Services, otherwise known as DERS, offers services throughout the whole journey of the research process. So we have team members to support you with wherever you're at with planning, conducting, or sharing the results of your research projects. The focus of today will be on funding, but there are many different components of the research journey. And of course, we are here to help support Fraser Health staff and medical staff to conduct high quality research. So let's dive right into the first part of today's workshop. How do you find funding opportunities to support the research that you want to do? Now, the very first step to be very clear about is what you're actually wanting funding for. To begin, it's very important to understand if the work that you're wanting to do is actually research. So on the screen, you can see that research is all about discovering new knowledge that can be applied to a wider population. Sometimes teams are wanting to explore more specific contexts or looking at very particular interventions that are specific to a context, a time, and a place that's very particular. Or maybe they might be looking to evaluate a very certain program within a specific context, within Fraser Health, for example. In those cases, your project may fall into the category more of evaluation or quality improvement. And there may sometimes be funding opportunities to support quality improvement and evaluation as well. But the focus of today's workshop is really finding funding to do research, that novel discovery purposes work that we do to find knowledge that will add to the greater body of evidence into the wider population and generalizable information that can be used for research purposes. So therefore, this is a really important first step to become very clear on whether the work that you're wanting funding for is actually research. On our Fraser Health research website, we have a great resource that explores the differences between research quality improvement and evaluation in depth. So please feel free to refer to that resource or attend some of our other research workshops if you'd like to learn more about some of the differences. And finally, it is also important to acknowledge that when we talk about research funding, we're also not talking about ongoing program funding, for example. So research funding may be useful to help demonstrate the usefulness of an initiative or show the worth of something that you're trying to get started or that you've been working on for a while. But finding funding for an ongoing program is very different than finding research funding for a particular project that you're working on. So now that we're clear on the fact that hopefully you're looking for research funding in particular, the next important step is to understand what stage are you at in your research. The major funding agencies that we'll talk about throughout this workshop have funding opportunities for all stages of the research journey. So an example would be if you're at the beginning of a research project, maybe you haven't even fully fleshed out an idea and you need funding to bring people together to convene and to start to discuss what a research project or a research agenda might look like on a very broad topic, for example. That could be exactly the funding that you can find for those convening and planning stages of a research project. Or maybe you want to run a pilot or a feasibility study to figure out if it makes sense to move forward with a full scale study for your research. Or maybe you need operating funds to run a full research study. You're ready to go. You have a proposal and a protocol in place, and you want to move forward with a full study. And you're looking for operating funds to do so. Or maybe you've completed your research and you need money to share your results out to the world and to tell everyone of the results and the information that you've gathered from your research study. So all of these stages in the research projects can have different types of grants to support them. So I talked already about planning or convening grants to help support some of that developmental work. Operating grants, I've mentioned, might be the most appropriate when you're actually doing your study and you need operational funding to do the study. And dissemination grants or knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization grants would be what you might be looking for if you're focusing on the results of sharing your work, sharing your results, and providing information to spread out the research that you've already done. Now, of course, with some grants, you may actually use the funding to do all of these different stages, and that will really come down to depend on what the funding opportunity can actually be used for. So like I mentioned, the question of what does the grant actually fund is going to be very dependent on the specific grant opportunity that you find. On the screen, you'll see some general types of grants, and different agencies will have different terminology for these different types, so they might call them slightly differently, but these are some of the broad categories of types of grants. And they will all have very specific parameters around what they will fund, things that they will and will not provide funding for. And the very important thing to know is that you really want to try and find an opportunity that fits with your project. Don't try and fit or squeeze your project into a funding opportunity that is not a correct fit. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the workshop as well. But generally, you can find grants to fund all different stages of your research, different research activities, as well as different types of grants that might provide different funding for different activities, whether that be salary or whether that be the operation of a research study or whether that be the planning stages or perhaps a dissemination. There are all different types of opportunities depending on where you're at and what you would like to receive funding for in your research journey. Where do you find this funding? Who has funding? That's a question that obviously is very important in the process of finding funding. So at this point, you've determined that what you're doing is research and you know what stage you're at in your project. And now you want to know who has the money. Where do you look? On the screen, you'll see some broad categories of typical funding organizations. So namely government or related organizations, foundations, associations, or corporate opportunities. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into each of those in the coming slides. In the first category of government, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, commonly referred to as CIHR, is the Government of Canada's health research agency, so where they provide the funding that then goes on to research teams to do research, health research across Canada. And they have many different funding opportunities, including their broad, what they call project grants. They're open competitions. They're delivered twice a year in the spring and the fall. And they have many other grant opportunities that cover a broad range of different types of research, different topics, different stages. Like I mentioned, there's planning and dissemination grants for this particular funder, as well as operating funds and all sorts of other types of funding opportunities. The topic areas and the focus of the funding opportunities will change by year, and you can find a list of their archived and their current funding opportunities on their ResearchNet website. And due to the fact that this is a Canada-wide funding body, the competitions are very competitive, so that is something to keep in mind if you are going to be applying to CIHR competitions. There are going to be a lot of other competitive high quality research studies that you will be competing against for the funding that they offer. Within British Columbia, at the provincial level, we have Michael Smith Health Research BC. So similar to CIHR, they offer a variety of funding opportunities. They have their version of a planning grant, which they call Convening and Collaborating Program. This is for teams who are at that development or planning stage to bring people together to start to put together a research agenda. And they have their REACH Awards, which are for projects that are at the dissemination stage of their research and looking for funding to share the results out to the world. They also offer salary awards and provide funding for health professionals and trainees that are doing work within the context of health research as well. So strongly encourage you to check out their website for current and future funding opportunities. On the screen, I've listed some other links to other federal funding opportunities. Some of these are research specific and others are more broad funding opportunities. So please feel free to pause on this slide here and make a note of these links and look into current and past examples as well as future upcoming funding opportunities within that context. The next broad category that we will explore is foundations. So locally, we have the Vancouver Foundation, which is a great resource for very impactful community-based funding opportunities that support research and also other types of programs or projects. The slide lists various other examples of foundations that have funding for research or other projects. And I will say that an important step when you're looking at funding opportunities is really, again, to understand the purpose and really what is the mission of the foundation, the organization, because you want to ensure that it aligns with the goals and the intentions of the work that you want funded. Of course, with any organization, they have goals and they have something that they are wanting to achieve as well. And that is definitely going to be the case for foundations that are set up with a particular purpose and mission. So really understand what it is that they want to fund and what are their goals and intentions for providing funding to you, and make sure that it does align with what you are hoping to do with your research and with your projects. Within Fraser Health, there are several hospital foundations. Most of them provide funding to our internal Fraser Health grant competitions. We'll speak to those in a few minutes. And they fund the projects that are awarded through those internal grant competitions specific to the areas and the populations that they serve. Following foundations, there's also associations or societies. These tend to be very large groups, a large group of organizations that might be able to fund your research work. So there are all different types of diverse types of foundations, associations, and societies. Some important types to consider are disease or condition, health condition, or population-specific organizations, associations, societies that that serve the populations that you are looking to research. So if there's a particular disease or health condition or a certain group of people that you're looking to explore your research about, try to see if there are organizations, associations, or societies that do serve those populations that you are working with in your research question. There are also professional associations. So these would be anything associated with a health profession, for example. And what I would very strongly encourage you to do is when you're starting to look for funding, when you have an idea, your topic idea, and the area you would like to explore, I encourage you to brainstorm all of the keywords that are associated with your project. So what specific diseases or health conditions relate to your topics, like aging or cancer or lung health or whatever it might be. And then brainstorm every type of profession related to all of your team members. What do they do? What are their jobs? What are their roles? Now, this list, this brainstorm list that you've created, this will note all of the keywords and professions that will be very important for when you actually start to search for funding from the organizations that might have money available related to particular health conditions or particular diseases or particular professional associations as well. So you can see some examples on the screen of associations, societies, or foundations that are connected to very specific health conditions, populations, or professions. And those are obviously just a couple examples of numerous organizations that exist and might have funding opportunities for your research projects. There's also a possibility to look for funding from private companies or industry. So as with any funding opportunity, you'll really want to consider all the requirements and if there are any additional considerations to keep in mind when accepting the money from a private company or from industry. For example, contracts or any expectations that might be connected to the money. We do have our Fraser Health Clinical Trials and Business Development team, and we are available to help you navigate some of those components as well that might come up from the Fraser Health perspective. So please do feel free to reach out and add that context when you are looking in the world of private companies or industries that might, the industry that might also be able to provide some funding to do your research project. Within Fraser Health, we also have our internal Fraser Health Seed and Strategic Priority Grant competition. This is a great opportunity to seek funding within the world of Fraser Health for Fraser Health specific projects. So please refer to our website that is noted on this slide for current guidelines for the competition to find out more about what you might need to do to apply for our internal funding competitions. So we've talked now about various organizations that offer funding opportunities for your research. And broadly, like I mentioned, they fall into the categories of government, foundation, associations or societies, corporate funding. And in general, there's a list of tools that I like to offer and places that you can search when you start to look for funding. Now, I've provided you with some very specific organizations, and all of those obviously have websites associated with them that you can look and access when you are trying to find funding. And I would suggest saving the websites of the major funders that I've mentioned in this presentation. So examples like CIHR at the federal level or Michael Smith, Health Research BC at the provincial level, and check in on them regularly or whenever you think you might be seeking funding so that you don't miss an opportunity. And keep in mind that many of the major funders, they typically stick to a fall and spring funding cycles and timelines. So there are times of the year when there are more opportunities and times when there might be fewer opportunities. So keep that in mind when you are searching and trying to prepare to look for funding for your research project. In addition to checking out the usual contenders that I've mentioned, the best thing to do when you're looking for a funding opportunity is to start a series of very targeted internet searches. So earlier, a few moments ago, I suggested that you make a list of all of the key terms related to your research topic and your population every single time that you're trying to find funding for a research project. And with that list, you can use that list of keywords to conduct a bunch of internet searches and adding on words such as funding or research funding or grants or awards at the end of all of these combination of searches. So do these searches for various topics, for example, adding on a disease or a health condition associated with your project and then putting the word funding or research funding or grant or award on the end. Or also adding on the health condition with the word society or foundation or association, or maybe searching for a particular profession like nurse and then foundation funding or research funding. So all of these combinations doing multiple searches hopefully will yield you lots of results of potential organizations and funding opportunities that are available to you for your project and your team in particular that relate to your context of your project and your team. As mentioned earlier, when you search the various foundations, societies, and associations connected with the health professionals on your team, just make sure that you do consider everyone that is on your team because there might be very specific funding opportunities available. Of course, you want to keep in mind the location of the organization when you are searching. You can set the contacts within Canada, and that's a good place, obviously, to start. But there are some international organizations, US-based organizations, and other places that do actually allow for Canadian or international applicants as well. So you can expand your search if you need, if you're not coming up with a lot more locally or within Canada. And when you are doing internet searches as well, you can also restrict by date to make sure that you are seeing current opportunities or current websites. But there is also some benefit to looking at past competitions as well, because you might get a sense of what might be coming as well. I also, when I do searches, if I don't see something that's listed that's current, I like to reach out to the contact information on the website and see if there is anything up and coming that might be coming in the future months, so that you know that you can prepare for a upcoming opportunity, so that you know in advance. So when you look at all the various websites of different organizations, if they don't have them, like I said, it's also helpful you can contact someone if you see a contact information, but it can also be really helpful to sign up for newsletters so that you're informed about future opportunities. And a lot of the organizations that you might search do have newsletters available where they can let you know when things do come, funding opportunities are announced. And another place to look for funding, in addition, obviously, to the internet and these searches that you're doing, is to ask people in your network, because oftentimes people might hear about opportunities. There's also networks through places like LinkedIn or online social media opportunities where you might hear about funding opportunities as well. And so those are great places to look and to ask if anyone has heard about funding opportunities for research, and in particular your project, especially if you are in networks of individuals that work with the same populations or the same disease-specific contexts or health conditions. Then they might have additional suggestions of places to reach out to for funding opportunities. Another great place to look is the acknowledgement section of journal articles. So oftentimes when journal authors write their manuscripts, they acknowledge the source of their research funding. So if you take a look at articles of similar research topics, you can see if any of them might have suggestions, or they have their acknowledgement of where they receive their research funding. And so that might be an additional opportunity for you to explore where similar projects have received funding from as well. And then the last suggestion on the screen mentions specialized software and database. Now, this is less of a suggestion for me. I just want to mention it because there are companies that exist that have closed, restricted databases of grant opportunities that they've compiled from around the internet. I would suggest doing your own search rather than paying for access to some of these systems, because you don't know what you're going to have access to until you pay, and they may not be location or topic specific. And a lot of the opportunities that they might show within their databases are going to be things that you would be able to find online through your targeted searches as well. So you might not find it a valuable resource to sign up for something, especially if it is a paid, a closed database that you do have to pay money to access. But they do exist, so I mentioned that as well, if that is something that you are interested in as well. Within Fraser Health, the great news is that we have access to specific resources within Fraser Health to help you find funding. I first off would strongly encourage you to sign up for Fraser Health Research Currents newsletter. So this newsletter is sent out every few months, and it includes a funding section that lists various opportunities that are current in that moment. We also have our fraserhealth.ca/research, our website, which has a funding section with links to both internal and external funding opportunities. And generally, we have links to funders that may or may not have current funding opportunities. So it's always a good idea to look there and look on the links and then see what might be either coming or currently listed as a funding opportunity. And finally, as a part of my role with Fraser Health as the research development specialist, I support Fraser Health staff and medical staff with funding searches. So please feel free to reach out if you want to discuss a project that you're interested in finding funding for, and we can talk through what some of the strategies might be and some of the potential opportunities that you might want to watch for to find funding for your particular project within the understanding of what you will be doing for your research study. So we've learned now about where to look for funding opportunities. Hopefully you have some searching tips and you have some resources that I've mentioned both within Fraser Health and resources that you can use on your own. So hopefully at this point, after you've done and you've used all of those tools, you've done all those steps, you've followed the process, maybe at this point you've been able to find something that you want to apply to. So here comes part two, another hard part, which is actually getting the funding. So how do you ensure that once you find a funding opportunity that you're able to write a an application that is competitive enough that you are successful in receiving the funding. And the purpose, obviously, of applying to a grant is to get funded. So in this section, we'll talk about how to increase your chances of being successful in receiving a grant that you apply to. Of course, a successful application is going to be one that fulfills the request. When you are about to apply for a funding competition, it's very important to understand who this funder is, who is making the decision about whether or not your project is funded, and what is their underlying motivation for actually providing the funding. And once you really understand that, you'll get a better picture of what you need to tell those people and how you need to align with them in order for them to want to fund your project. Overall, if I had to summarize how you get funding, I would say the grant application needs to be packaged well. So what this means is it needs to be well researched. You need to explain the gap or the problem that needs to be addressed. And then you need to tell them how you are using some innovative strategies to address this need, to fill this gap, to fix this problem that you've described. You need to have feasible goals. You need to have measurable objectives, and you need to phrase your research question logically so that they understand exactly what you're going to be looking at with your research. And overall, it needs to be very well organized and flow in a way that the reviewers can actually understand what you are trying to say. And we're going to dive in a little bit deeper of how you fulfill all of those things to make sure that your project, your application is packaged well in a way that is going to increase your likelihood of success with a grant application. On the flip side of that, here are some common reasons why applications are declined or why they don't receive funding. So you can see that it might come down to eligibility. Maybe the project is not even eligible for the competition, or they didn't use the right application form, or they submitted late, or they included wrong parts of the application, or maybe the amount of funding that they're requesting doesn't align with the competition. And another thing that we're going to talk about later is maybe they didn't even consider the evaluation criteria and it doesn't fit with the competition. And some of the more disappointing things to see people get rejected for are things like editing and careless editing and organization things. When you have all the components, but it's not organized or it's not edited in a way that looks like you took the time and effort to put in into the application, then that can obviously also lead to a rejection as well. So we're going to try to avoid all of these things by following 8 very important steps to help you increase the likelihood that you can have a competitive application that will be more likely to be funded. So let's start with number 1. So number 1 is to make sure that you have a very strong fit between your project and the funder. So first off, are you eligible? When you wear your Fraser Health hat, you may be eligible for many funding agencies, but not necessarily all of them. So you do want to dive into the eligibility criteria of the funding opportunity that you found. And if you need help with that, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and I can dive in a little deeper or even ask the question of the funding organization. And Fraser Health does have a few ways of qualifying as eligible through our the way that our organization is set up. So confirming that you are eligible while you're wearing your Fraser Health hat and applying as a Fraser Health individual, you do want to confirm, obviously, right off the bat that you are eligible for the opportunity. Eligible can also mean that you have the support of your Fraser Health Research Department to be applying for this opportunity wearing your Fraser Health hat within your Fraser Health role. You also obviously want to ensure that the fit is aligned in terms of the research goals. Do the grant priorities match your goals that you're trying to do? And that could be from a number of different angles. So are the topics aligned? Is the stage of the research of where you're at, what they're actually funding? And is the funding amount going to align with what you need? Is it too much or is it too little or is it just enough? And more than that, how much is available overall and what is the competitiveness? So if there's not very much, if there's only one grant available and you know that there's a very competitive competition, for example, is that going to work with the proposal that you're putting in? Do you need to provide any matched funding? So some competitions require you to come to the table with money that either money or in-kind contributions that your organization is also putting towards this funding opportunity. So know ahead of time if you do need to provide any match funds, because that would obviously make you eligible or not eligible to apply for it, depending on if you have the match funding. You also want to know what you can actually charge against the grant. What can you budget for? If you want salary and you need salary, and that's the only way that you'd be able to do the research, is it even an eligible expense? And oftentimes it's not, unless it is a salary award specifically. If you need money for equipment and your project would not be able to go forward without equipment, for example, would the grant actually be able to purchase the equipment that you need? And so this first step is really making sure that you have that strong fit between the criteria and what is being offered from the grant and what you are wanting to do. You also want to think of some things. I mentioned the competitiveness of the application, but also think about the amount of effort that you'll need to put into the application. Are you able to do the amount of work that's required? Some applications can be very extensive, and you do have to keep in mind that you may not receive funding at the end of the application. So is that dedication of the time and energy that you can put in to the application that you need to put in, is that actually something that you're able to do? And once you receive it, if you are successful in being funded, will they need extensive reports on progress and finance over the whole course of the grant? And are you able to do that as well? So some agencies are a little bit more official with reporting. For example, CIHR has standard reporting, and there are some other organizations, examples might be foundations, that may be more interested in hearing stories and experiences and that kind of thing. And so they will all have different reporting requirements. So just make sure that you're aware of what would actually be involved if you are successful in receiving the funding, and know that ahead of time. Is it something that you'll be able to commit to? Do you have enough time to build a competitive application based on the timeline? Have you found out about the competition 1 week before the deadline, or do you have a longer lead up so that you can prepare an application that will be competitive? And sometimes you don't hear about it. The whole application can have a fairly short timeline. So just make sure that you are able to put in the amount of work and time that you do need to build a competitive application. It can also be very helpful to look at past examples of funded projects as well to see, is it the right fit with your project, and how did those projects in the past that were funded, how did they align, or how are they similar to the project that you're looking to also have funded? Is that right funding match that fit there with your project and this particular funding opportunity that you have found? So when you've considered all those things and determined, how you're going to, are you going to go ahead with it? And even as you're trying to determine that fit, really where you're going to be looking and where you're going to be doing a deep dive is into the guidelines. You want to know the guidelines inside and out. You want to know what all of the documents associated with this funding opportunity have to say. And you want to make note of keywords and use them in your application to highlight exactly how your work, your project matches the funding opportunities. Some funding opportunities also offer the option to connect with their staff for questions. Sometimes they even offer feedback or on the project or on eligibility. That might be more rare, but if that is available, really consider reaching out to the program coordinators of the funding opportunities, because that is a resource that is there, and you can potentially get some feedback or some tips from them towards making your project, your application, more competitive. Now, keep in mind that some organizations might not give out any additional information aside from the documents that they have publicly available. And generally as well, even if you are talking to someone who is providing you information on the grant opportunity, keep in mind that they are not always or not even often, perhaps, the person who will make the decision on your grant. So you do have to take the information that they're giving you and also apply it to the context, knowing that someone else is likely going to be the reviewer and the decision maker on whether your grant is funded. When you start working on your application, make sure you plan out the process and also the timeline that you're going to follow and all of the different pieces that you need to prepare. Make sure you make note of every single piece, because in addition to your research proposal, there are usually a lot of other components that take a lot of time. Things like designing your CV or updating your CV, team member descriptions and maybe their CVs as well, letters of support, all sorts of other documents that you might need to add into your application. And those all take a lot of time as well. So know all of the parts and write out a plan and a timeline for every single part of the application. Now, some applications might also have a registration or a letter of intent stage and then a full application stage. So know the deadlines because there are deadlines for each, and you do need to, most of the time, do the letter of intent or registration in order to do the full application. So make sure you meet that first deadline in order to carry through with the full application. I will say, and I'm sure many others will say, that things always take longer than you might expect. So make sure you leave lots of time. And when you plan out your application timeline and you have your working document, make sure you do add in additional time for everything. Fraser Health grant applications also require approval from our research VP. I am able to support with obtaining this approval, but I also need to know about the applications at least 1 week in advance. So please, when you do know that you are going to be applying for a funding opportunity wearing your Fraser Health hat, please do notify us in our department about your intention to apply so we can let you know about any approvals that might need to be done prior to your submission to the funding opportunity. And here you'll also see it talks about a working document. And what I would suggest is all of this, everything that you're working on, keep it outside of the online system. So for many funding opportunities, you might need to enter things into an online submission system that you will ultimately click submit and send it on to the funder. But when you are working on your drafts, keep drafts and keep multiple drafts and work offline off of that online system because you don't want to lose work. And oftentimes with online systems, there can be little glitches or things that happen where you could potentially lose work. So make sure you do keep a draft off of those systems so that you always have something to go back to if something does go awry when you are putting in your online system. And ultimately, it often I see with teams is that the last steps when you're pulling everything together and doing the final submission, that again takes a lot of time to make sure that everything is in there and everything's uploaded and there are no errors. So always make sure that you do upload and submit well in advance of the final deadline. So step number 1 was making sure that the fit was right. Step number 2 was knowing those guidelines inside and out. Step number 3, we talked about making a plan and a working document so that you have the timeline and the plan to go through completing the application. And, hopefully in step 2, you really reviewed those guidelines and you came across, hopefully, evaluation criteria. But I wanted to make step 4 a very specific information about the evaluation criteria in particular, because this is something that sometimes it's even in a separate document to the rest of the funding information, and sometimes this is overlooked, which it's very important not to overlook the evaluation criteria because these are the criteria that your project must meet to be funded. Like I mentioned earlier, borrow keywords from the guidelines and also from the evaluation criteria and address them in your application. So make sure those words are there and you state how you fit with the criteria. Make sure you include everything that is listed in those evaluation criteria and again, be very clear where they can find all the information they need to figure out if you fulfill the evaluation criteria. Be very clear. Make sure reviewers don't have to look for things and keep in mind that reviewers, they're usually reading multiple applications and they may be tired. So don't make them search, don't make them try and find things and see if you've checked off all the points. Be very clear and specific and very organized of where to find the information so that they can see that you meet all of the evaluation criteria in their guidelines. Also keep in mind, who are these reviewers? So what type of review is your application going to go through? Are there going to be multiple reviewers? Are they going to be experts? Are there going to be patient reviewers as well? Who is going to be reviewing your application? And consider that your reviewers, they may not always be experts in your topic area. So keep their level of understanding in mind when you're writing your application and make sure that it is going to address all of the questions that they may have when they are evaluating your application. You want to keep the reviewers on your good side, because they are the ones that have the evaluation criteria and are checking off and deciding whether or not you are funded. All right, step 5. Like I mentioned, you can help them reviewers out by have everything all laid out. And this is what step 5 is all about, writing and organizing well. Now, this section is hopefully going to sound like common sense, but one thing I can tell you as someone that reviews a lot of grant applications, this is a major sticking point for so many teams. And unfortunately, it is ultimately a downfall for many teams as well. So make sure that you write very plainly, you cut out words, and you're clear, concise, correct, and compelling. There's some tips on the screen of how to do that using short sentences, no jargon, spell out or write out acronyms in full, use active language, smooth transitions, try to organize using formatting if possible, things like bolding or headings, and overall just making sure that the experience of them looking at your application is very organized and easy to follow. You've seen this slide before. I talked about packaging your application as packaging it well. And I wanted to circle back to this because this is your ultimate goal. Like I said, even though this seems like common sense, so many teams trip up on all of these things. And you want to make sure everything on this list is present, is very clear. And if you need help with these things, number 1 and 2, we have Fraser Health Library Services that can help you with literature search if you're working through making sure that your proposal is well researched and that you actually know and understand the gap that you're trying to fill. If you're struggling with some of the other pieces, organizing sections or making sure that you have feasible goals and measurable objectives and you've written your research question logically, I'm able to consult and review your grant applications, and I can help with organizing and helping you communicate your research plans, and I can read it through as a non-expert and let you know if you are conveying what you want to convey within your grant application. We also have many other workshops that can help teach you valuable information about how to design and develop your research proposal. So please do refer to our website and our education calendar for more information and other topics that you can look into to really help you write and organize your proposal in a way that will increase the likelihood that it can be funded. You need to convey, ultimately, the objectives of your project, the significance, why they should fund it. You want to tell the story to the reviewers that has a beginning, which is the gap, acknowledging the problem, the middle, which is how you're going to address that gap and why it is needed and why what you are doing is so special. And then the end. What will happen because of your work? What is next? And again, why must this be done now? That's the story you're trying to tell. It should have a logical flow. It should convey the urgency, the importance, and you need to convince the reviewers why they need to partner with you by providing funding. And keep in mind that depending on the type of funder, different things may be important. So for example, for some funders, numbers might be an important metric. On the other hand, for some funders, stories or emotions may be very important. So that might be more with foundations, for example. So overall, just make sure you convey the significance and potential impact for your project and do it within the lens of the funder that you are applying to with your project. So by now, the fit was right, you follow the guidelines, you follow the evaluation criteria, you made the plan, you had a working document, you've been working on your application, you've been using it as a guide, you've written clearly, you've written a well-organized application. One very important piece, step number 6 of the application that you want to review at the end to make sure you include all of the components of your project is a very well justified budget. So what are all the expenses you have on this project? Are they all eligible expenses for starters? And have you written very strong reasons justifying every single expense? If you already have financial support or in-kind support, things that you are bringing to this project, mention them as well to show the support that you already have access to. And know, again, from the guidelines or your criteria, know whether you should be rounding numbers to the nearest 1 or 10 or 1,000 or whatever it may be, or if you should be putting exact amounts, or whether you need quotes. So depending on the funding opportunity, they might have different guidelines on what you need to put in your budget and how you need to write your budget, whether they're providing a template or whether you're able to be a little bit more flexible in how you write your amounts. Ultimately, it comes back to the guidelines for that particular funding opportunity, but make sure that you are justifying every single item in your budget and also considering every single expense that you might need to have in your budget as well. The budget is a very important part of the project because it is justifying the amount of money that they are going to give you if they choose to fund you. So there are many costs and expenses that you'll want to consider. Obviously, things that might come to mind immediately are things like human resources, so things hiring. This includes staff, but it might also include people that are contributing to your project, and you might provide them honoraria, for example. This includes training. This includes planning things that you might need money for. It could include things like equipment or different types of consumables that you will use in your project. If you are going to be sharing the information after your project and the results, it might include some budget items for knowledge mobilization or dissemination, travel, conferences, associated costs with travel and presenting your information. And you'll see at the bottom there, it talks about Fraser Health has a travel and business expenses policy. So when you are preparing a budget, please do refer to that policy so you're able to put costs that are directly associated with what Fraser Health allows, for example, with things related to travel. As well, you might need to know costs associated with particular technology things or items within Fraser Health or subscriptions. And so again, if you can add those within the context of what it would cost for Fraser Health and have very specific numbers and justify those in the budget, do attach those within your budget items. So for all of these expenses, don't hesitate to reach out to me. In our department, we have advice for different amounts to budget for these items. As well, you'll see the bottom bullet point of the list there is indirect costs or overhead. So Fraser Health has an overhead policy for indirect costs associated with research. Refer to the Fraser Health policy as well as your specific funding guidelines as well for if those types of costs are eligible to determine if your project needs to add overhead to your budgets. And like I mentioned, don't hesitate to reach out to our department. I am happy to review budgets and provide advice on certain amounts to budget for your particular project, depending on what your funding opportunity allows and what you need to complete your research study. After you've justified your budget, you prepared your budget, collect feedback. Step number 7. So think of all the different people around you, your colleagues, other people on your team, experts in your field, your people in your family that are around you that have no idea anything about your study or your research. Our department, our staff within DERS, these are all people that you can receive feedback from. You'll also see patient partners listed there as well. So patient partners could have a very unique perspective coming from a patient or client experience, and they can really help improve your application. They can also help review it from that patient or client perspective and make sure your application is accessible and readable for all reviewers. And not only at the feedback stage, but it is a very good idea to include patient partners in your application team and within writing your application as well to really help strengthen your application and make sure it does include that patient and client perspective for your research. So once you gather feedback, you can again gather it from all sorts of different people. Ask them to check everything, to check your word counts, to check your page counts, to look for acronyms or things that aren't spelled out, to look for grammar and mistakes, typos that you might have missed, and also ask for feedback on the layout and how things look and how things were easy to follow and were there things that could help with the readability or the organization. Of course, you want to do all of this yourself, but it's a great idea to get additional feedback from those people who weren't who don't know as much. And when you take a step back and allow other people to look, hopefully they will have feedback that can help expand your application and increase the likelihood that it is funded. Leave a lot of time for this. I know time is always the tricky part in grant application, but this is such an important step. So please do allow and include time for feedback to both gather it and then apply it, and then even to ask for more feedback after you've made your revisions to make sure that you have kept everything in mind that the people have provided with their feedback. Now, unfortunately, you don't always get funded the first time or the second or even the third. So if you are not funded the first time, learn from these rejections, we could call them, or these opportunities where you were not funded. It is a very important opportunity to learn. Read the reviews if they've provided feedback or reviewers have given you information. Read through what they've offered and what they've told you, and really take it to heart and how you could revise and apply it to your application to strengthen it. Reapply if you're able to reapply either to that opportunity or to other funding opportunities. Now that you know how to find opportunities, look for other opportunities. Often with funding opportunities like CIHR, for example, it is very, very common to have to apply, reapply, and reapply. And each time, some funding opportunities like CIHR will also offer you the opportunity to directly respond to reviewer feedback from your previous submission so that you can directly communicate, essentially. They won't be the same reviewers, but communicate with the reviewers that you have taken that opportunity from that rejection to learn and to revise and to strengthen your application so that it is a stronger, more high quality, competitive application, which hopefully will be funded in one of these future funding cycles. So that brings me to the end of our 8 tips for writing a competitive application to actually get the funding. So I'd say find the right match. Make sure it is a proper match from your project to the funding opportunity. Know the guidelines, understand them, communicate with the program coordinator, build a timeline so that you have enough time to do all of these steps and work on a strong document. Make sure you know how you're being evaluated and make sure you revise and adapt your application to fit those criteria. Write and organize well. Prepare that well-justified budget and make sure you have everything that you need money for, and ask for feedback. Let people tell you how you could potentially improve your application. And again, if you are not successful, make sure that you do take that as a learning opportunity to apply to future opportunities so that you are successful in future rounds. And I added an additional 9th one there. It's don't give up. It is not uncommon to not be funded, like I say, the first, second, third time, but there is a funding opportunity out there that you can match, and with enough revision and a well-written, high-quality, competitive application using all of these points, you can receive research funding. And we look forward to the day that you come to us and say that you've been funded, and we can talk about all the exciting steps of what comes next once you receive your funding. So thank you so much for attending this workshop. At this point, you should hopefully be able to confidently understand how to find funding depending on what stage and type of research you're doing. You know many places to look, and you can refer back to earlier in this presentation on where and how to search to find opportunities. And you also have knowledge on how to write a competitive application, how to make sure that your application is funded. And in addition to that, I hope that I've shared that you know what resources we can offer through our Department of Evaluation and Research Services here at Fraser Health. So do not hesitate to reach out. As I've mentioned throughout, we have so many resources available to you on our website. So please explore and consider attending more of our workshops. Explore all of the resources that are available to you and our education catalog to see what else you can learn. And again, do not hesitate to reach out. We are happy to consult and connect with teams who are at any stage in the research journey as they move forward within Fraser Health. So thank you so much for attending, and best of luck with your research.